Welcome to Bushy Run Trading Post. My name is Wendy, and I'm going to be telling you about why trading posts were so important in the development of this region and in the expansion westward. When the first Europeans came to this country, they were looking for riches. They were looking for gold and spices and all of these types of things. But what they found instead were riches in the form of furs. Now, at this time in Europe, most of the fur animals had been hunted almost to the point of extinction. So when they realized that the woods of Pennsylvania were full of all different animals bearing all these different furs, they realized this was an opportunity to make a lot of money. Now, the main people in this area were the French and the British, and they were competing with each other to establish ties with the natives who would provide them with the furs. They had two very distinct types of trading. The British would build a fort or a trading post, and the natives would bring the furs to them to be traded. Unfortunately for the natives, when the British would build these posts, settlers would follow, and this would lead to more and more people, which caused the natives to be pushed further and further back. The natives much preferred the French way of trading because the French would go into the villages, and they would get the furs there. They would live with the natives. A lot of times they would intermarry with the natives, and they would become part of their system. But both countries were trying very hard to maintain trade. So even though the British system was not preferred by the natives, the British had better trade goods. So the natives were very smart, and they realized this, and a lot of them traded with the British. Now, the woods of Pennsylvania were full of furs. This was, of course, is the skunk. This was not a preferred fur. If you had skunk fur, you really didn't get anything in trade, so you would use it to decorate your clothing or make collars or mittens. This was another animal in Pennsylvania that we had a lot of. This animal became famous because he was made into a coonskin cap, as we hear about people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone wearing these coonskin caps. Again, these were very good animals if you didn't have a lot of money. You could use these for collars and mittens and all of these different types of things. This is a tiny little animal who lived along the waterway. He's a muskrat. He has very thick fur, but he's very tiny, so you would have to bring a lot of these to the trading post to get good things in trade. Sometimes they would use him for trim on clothing or mittens or things of that type. This is a coyote. He's got very thick, beautiful fur, and the ladies would like him because they could wear him as a stool, or they could make purses or all kinds of things out of this fur. This was one that would have brought more in trade than the others, but not as much as the big preferred fur. This is a muskrat. He also lived along the waterway. His fur is very thick and luxurious, which makes him waterproof. You would get more in trade for a muskrat because of this. And people would make stoles and decorations and purses and mittens and things like this with a muskrat. This is a gray fox. Again, he would make a nice stool or different things like that, but he was not what people wanted then either. Now, we did have red fox come into the community, and they were brought in by the British for fox hunting, and some of them got away, and that was how the red fox were introduced to the woods of Pennsylvania. This is a bobcat. It has beautiful markings on its fur, so this would have made lovely decorations for ladies' hats or stools or mittens. So you would get more in trade for a bobcat than you would for some of these others. This was the fur that was the standard of trade. And this, of course, is a deer skin or a buckskin. And when you would bring these to the trading post, they would be weighed, and you would get so much in trade for each of the buckskins. Now, eventually, we have picked up the term buckskin, and we've taken the term buck to make our word for money. And this comes from this period. Now, this was what the natives used to make their clothing until they started trading for fabrics. This was all they had. But it wasn't very soft, it wasn't very pliable, so it would be very tough to make this into something that would be comfortable to wear. So what they would do was they would tan this deer hide and make it into this nice soft leather. And there were a couple of different ways they would do this, and one is brain tanning. They would take an animal's brain and they would put it in a pot and stir it up. They would put this on a rack and spread that brain material all over this fur. And when it dried, they would scrape it off with a stone or a shell or a knife. And now they would have this nice, soft, pliable leather that they could make into all kinds of different clothing. Now, as I said, this is one of the furs that was brought in most often. So this became the standard of measure as far as trading. All of these were wonderful, but in Europe, the people wanted this pelt. They wanted a beaver pelt. If you could afford to wear beaver, you were considered to be rich or royal or very distinguished. This was a fashion statement. So, this was the most desired fur. As I said, there weren't a lot of these left in Europe, so when they found these here in the woods of Pennsylvania, they were delighted. This brought a lot in trade. Now, the beaver skin has 2 layers of fur. The outer is the guard cells, and then there's a soft, thick fur underneath, which makes it waterproof. The natives were very smart, and they realized that if these guard cells were taken off the fur, they would get much more in trade. So they would hang them outside. And after a few weeks or months, these guard hairs would fall off, and they would have this nice, thick beaver pelt, which they would take in trade. Now, they would come into the trading post with all of these wonderful furs, and they would trade them for different things. And they would talk about a buck. Now, as I said, that was the standard for trade. This chart shows what you could get for a buck. For example, if you had 1 buck, you might be able to get a pint of powder. If you had 2 does, which would equal 1 buck, you might be able to get some wampum. So all of these things were listed, but for the natives, they would not have been able to read these, so they would use pictograms to give all the equivalents of the trading items. And I'm going to be showing you some items for trade. Once it had been determined how many bucks the natives received with all the furs, they could go shopping. And these are some of the items that they would have received in trade. One of the items that you could receive in trade were these beads. Now, they may not seem important to us now, but at that time, the native women would have loved these beads because they had to make beads individually, either by forming them in clay or taking them from shells from the quahog clan or other ways. So when they had a whole package of colored beads, they were thrilled. And why was this thrilling to the man who was trading? Because it was a matriarchal society and the men wanted to please their wives. Because the wives could throw them out if they were not good husbands. So keeping her happy was very important, and they would have liked the beads. Another thing that would have made their lives a lot easier with flint and steel. And hopefully this will work. But this is something that they would use to produce fire, and I'm not getting any sparks. Oh, there's some. And this would have made their lives easier because now they could go and start fires whenever they were traveling. Prior to this, if their fires went out or they traveled, they would have to build a fire, starting it over again. And if it was wet and moist, they would have a difficult time doing this. Other things they would have liked were jewelry, different kinds of jewelry. And the men wore as much jewelry as the women because, again, the men wanted to please their mates and find really good girlfriends. This is a gorget. The natives really liked this. This was worn by the British and French and army guys, the officers, and the natives liked this. So, being good salesmen, they would made a trade gorget, which is very inferior in quality. It doesn't have all of the wonderful designs and things, but this was something that the natives liked, the trade gorget. They also liked these pocket knives. They could put these in their pouches. And this was a vast improvement over the stone knives and the shell knives because these blades would not break. So this was something that was highly desirable. This is an awl. This was used for a lot of different things, but this was used to make the holes in moccasins and in clothing so they could tie them. This is a nail. Now this would have been used more by the settlers than this would by the natives, but these were very important. They were so important, in fact, that if you were moving, you would burn your old cabin down and collect all the nails to take with you to the next site. These cooking pots would have been really loved by the women because they would have been so useful for so many things. You could gather water, you could boil water, you could gather berries, you could make soup. All of these things were very, very helpful in the lives of the native women. This tin cup wouldn't excite us, but at that time, this was very useful as well because, again, you could cook in it, you could gather things in it, you could drink from it, and it did not break. Now, the natives did amazingly wonderful work with beads and shells, and they would have designed these. These would have been very useful. This would have been something they would have used to carry their belongings in, and this would have been a neck knife, which they would have worn, and it would be very handy for skinning and for other things. All of these items were very, very important to the natives, but there was one thing they desired above all others, and that was the musket. The musket gave them the ability to hunt, to protect their family, and to wage war. These were desired above all other things, and so the French had a very cheap version of the musket. The English musket was a little better, and the natives would come and very eagerly bring their furs in to trade for these muskets. But there were other things needed when you had a musket, and one of the things was lead balls. These were made in a gelatin-like mold, and they were very soft, and they would make a big hole when they would enter a person's body. These were very important because without these, you would have just used your musket as a club. Like the flint and steel, flint was required to make the spark that would ignite the powder, which would come in this lovely powder horn. The natives realized that the powder would not get wet or go bad in a powder horn, so these were carried to keep their powder dry. The natives became very proficient with guns, and they were excellent hunters. Now, after the French and Indian War, when the French lost, the English came up with the idea of banning the trade of guns to the natives. This was very hurtful because by this time in their history, natives no longer made their bows and arrows. They were pretty much dependent on the musket to preserve their way of life. So this was one of the main points of contention which got Pontiac to have the Confederation formed that would lead to Pontiac's War. So this was one of the main causes, was taking away the weapons from the natives. This has been pretty much what they would have done in the fur trade. Again, the natives were very eager to trade their furs for all of these things that they could not supply for themselves. As the animals were becoming less found around this area, they would move further and further west. And this caused a lot of expansion into the native territories, which caused more troubles. So the fur trade was very important in the life of the community at that time, and as a cause of expansion. I hope you enjoyed your visit to the fur trade. I hope you learned some things and come and see us. Thank you.